Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
So, folks, today I've got with me my friend from New York, Peter DiRienzo. Peter and I have been friends for about 20 years. Peter is a pro in my profession. I've always respected him and looked up to him. The interesting thing is that he operates in a completely different world than I've operated in my career when I was in business for myself, at least. From South Georgia, rural Georgia, to New York City is two little bit different places. And when I was growing up, Peter, I thought that it was a million miles from Reynolds, Georgia to New York City. And then I started having friends in New York City and realized it's not very far at all. We all do the same thing. So, Peter DiRienzo, how are you doing today?
I am doing just well, my friend. Happy New Year to you and your family and all your wonderful listeners.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you joining me here. Peter, why don't you let's start off talking a little bit about your life and how in the world you got in the funeral business in New York City. I know people will find it very interesting.
Well, I'm a third-generation funeral director, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. My grandmother was the third woman in the state of New York to have a dual funeral director's license. But I didn't really find funeral directing until when I was in college. I went to college to be an accountant. I was always good with numbers. I would be able to figure out baseball batting averages off the top of my head, and I figured I'd make a living in finance. My younger brother went right to funeral school, and I told a story that my third year of accounting, I was doing very well. When the last exam was over, I was very upset, and my friend said to me, "What's the matter?" I said, "Well, this is too boring. I can't do this for a life. I've got to go do something else. I just can't be an accountant." And it's funny because I actually wound up marrying an accountant. And I had a conversation with my dad. And I said, I really think that I want to go into funeral service. And he goes, "Well, come on in." And unfortunately, about a year later, my dad passed away at the age of 47 with 5 sons, a wife, and a mother to take care of. And we sort of pieced it together, and we've made a nice career out of this, Bruce.
So he was 47 when he passed away. So is that what you just said?
Yes, sir. I was 22 years old when my dad passed away.
So from my perspective, my dad died when I was 40 years old, and I'd already been in the business for a while. But when my parents died, they died within 6 months of each other. I had got a new understanding of what I've been doing. So when you got in this business, you already had a good understanding of what you're doing if you just lost your dad.
Yes and no. I've been involved. We lived on top of the funeral home on the 3rd floor apartment, my mom and dad and 4 of my brothers. And then my Irish mother finally put the law down to my dad. She said, "I can't live on top of this funeral home with 4 kids. You're going to have to do something." And my dad wound up buying the house right next door to the funeral home. So that was my dad's compromise. Oh, and wow. I heard your story and one of your compromises about the phone. I remember the phone growing up. We had a 2-line phone in our apartment, and we used to call it the bat phone. Me and my brothers could be in the middle of wrestling or playing football inside, and when that second phone lit up and we knew it was the funeral home, we became quiet as a church mouse because my mom said, "I can help you and solve any of your problems, but if you make any noise when that telephone from the funeral home rings, you're on your own, boys." And we took her advice very well.
You know what I remember about the telephones, when we got the first answering machine that ever hit our county, and that thing, I say, it was a big box. You had to have 6 pallbearers to get that thing in the house. And I'll never forget Daddy's message on that machine. Said, "Hello, this is Ed Goddard of Goddard Funeral Home, and this is a telephone answering device." I'll be away from this phone. So
we started out with beepers, driving around New York City with a beeper. You get beeped and you have to call in. So you'd have to have a quarter to return the phone call. Then you'd have to have another quarter to call the family. So yes, we started out with beeper technology, and it was wonderful.
So when I started, it was before beepers. Of course, I went through the beeper stage, but we were completely in bondage. And that's why the answering machine got to be so important. So when you were in business, did you make your own removals in New York?
Yes, we did. Actually, I worked for a third-party trade service when I first started, and so did my brother. But at some point, we were making our own removals and transfers, taking the decedents into our care.
Yeah. And so how long did it take you? I mean, New York's a big city. When you got a call, how long did it take you to get?
We had someone come in with a consulting firm with the company that we work for, and they said that we were taking too long to make removals from the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And I said to the gentleman, I said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't you come in the car with me and you can see what we're up against? Because he said it should take 40 minutes. And we were literally going about 40 blocks north and 2 blocks south. And we came back an hour and a half later after making the removal, and that whole thing went away because you can't time a removal in New York City. There's no such animal.
Right. I can't imagine. Where I came from, people were expecting us quickly. And we would go on a death call like we went on an ambulance call. And we did run the ambulance service. We would be in a hurry because we know that people wanted us to come in a hurry. I had a guy one time, Peter, call me, and he said, my mother-in-law is about to die any minute. I want to go ahead and call you and let you know that she's about to pass away. And of course I knew him. And then he said, I want you to come on now. I said, well, has she passed away? He said, no, but she's going to go any minute. I said, sir, I can't come out in the hearse, and wait for your mother-in-law to pass away. He said, well, we want to get her out of here as quick as we can. I mean, after she passes away, I said, well, I can't come out there and wait. I can just see myself sitting out in the yard in the hearse waiting on somebody to pass away. Right.
Well, I'll tell you this, I used to work with an Asian funeral director, and the Asians had very lucky numbers, and he gave us a transfer, and I called him back and I said, we can't make the transfer. And he said, why not? I said, well, the decedent hasn't passed away yet. And he said, you don't understand. Today's a lucky day. He has to die today. I said, that's out of my hands. I can't help you with that.
Peter, one of the things that I know that I tell people all the time in our business is that what we do is a honorable way to make a living. Sometimes we get blasted on some of the stuff you read in newspapers or magazines that, funeral directors can take advantage of people and be a bunch of vultures or whatever. And what I have seen is people like you and many others I have met are some of the most quality people I've ever known in my life. Have a compassion for people, but a passion for helping others. And it's a pretty fulfilling profession to be in when you can take somebody's call and be able to be there for that family for something they'll never forget the rest of their life, do it in a professional way, look after all the details. You will build a relationship that lasts the rest of your life. That's surely how it happens in Georgia. And I think it happens the same way in New York City, right?
Absolutely. Even though my dad wasn't around very long for my adult life, my father instilled two qualities in me as a funeral director that we carry on to this day with my brothers as well. The first one was, we can't do anything for the deceased. We make it easier for the people that have to live. And the second thing that he taught us is that always remember that you're dealing with someone on the worst day of their life. You can't have a bad day. You can't have an off day. And those things have always been installed in me. And that's how I try to follow my career as a funeral director.
Yeah. And you don't have second chances at doing a funeral. You don't get seven. I've had everything in the world happen on a funeral. I know you have. I'm sure you got stories of funerals that just went wrong that was out of your control, right?
Oh, 100%. I always tell the story that you have to give specific directions when you're dealing with our wonderful staff associates to keep our doors open. But we had a new driver once, and it was a very Italian family. And I remember standing in front of the funeral home, and the viewing was up on the third floor. The minute that the limousine pulled up in front of the funeral home, I knew there was a problem just by their body language and the way they were looking at me. And we went upstairs to the third floor in an elevator. Not a word was spoken. They went into the room. They paid their respects for the last time to their loved one. And one of the sons grabbed me on the side and he goes, "Do you people do this every day?" And I said, "Sir, I would love to help you, but did something go wrong today?" He goes, "Well, you're a limousine driver. Do you do that? Do you provide that type of service every day?" And I said, sir, you're going to have to enlighten me. I don't know what happened. What did he do? Well, he picked up my mama, he picked up my wife, he picked up my son, my daughter-in-law, my nephew, got us all in the wonderful limousine that you sent. And then on the way to the funeral home, he ran us all through the car wash. And I said, sir, I can guarantee you that it's not a service that we provide on a daily basis.
Oh, wow. I had a funeral one time, Peter, that it was a graveside service. The man's name that passed away was Mr. White. And the family said they wanted the Methodist minister in town, in our little town, to do the service. He had never met Mr. White. So he came over the night before the funeral and met with that family. He must have been with them for an hour. I mean, he got all kind of information to get ready to prepare for the eulogy and the funeral service and the whole thing. And I remember we had two tents set up. It was a graveside. It was two tents set up. It was cold that day with wind blowing. So we had the side curtains up. I had a PA system out there. And the preacher started calling the Smith family and Mr. Smith, and there wasn't a Smith there. And I stood there a minute and said, surely he just made a mistake. He'll get this right. And then he kept saying Smith. And one of the grandchildren stood up and came to me and said, you got to do something. So I walked around the side curtain and he was talking about something else. And I was hoping that he was moving on, and he just made a mistake. Then he said Smith 2 or 3 times. So I had to step around the curtain in the middle of while he was talking, tap him on the shoulder and said, his name is White. And this minister, it was probably at least 30 seconds before he said another word. I mean, he was absolutely lost after that. It's amazing the things that can happen at a funeral.
Well, in today's society up here in New York, we have these wonderful ministries of consolation who meet with the family and go over all the details. But when I was first coming up, the only way that the priest would find out who had passed away was by reading the nameplate on the casket when you got to church. And my brother Andrew was young at the time, and he really wasn't paying attention, and there was no nameplate. So the priest was confused. And the priest pointed to where the nameplate would normally be, and he said to my brother, what's the name? And my brother thought that he had asked him his name, and he responded, Andrew. And for the first part of the Mass, the priest called this woman named Josephine Andrew, and we corrected that one. So you have to give specific instructions. And I'll tell you one more story about another one of my brothers who was helping us out during a college. And this family came in and made such a demand that they had to make sure that they got this state-of-the-art baby carriage back. This baby carriage cost thousands of dollars, and they just insisted to make sure that they got the carriage back. And sure enough, my brother, to his word, did return the baby carriage to this family. And on the way back from the cemetery, the dispatcher called them up and said, is there everything okay with your funeral? And my brother said, yeah, everything's fine. You made it. I made sure the family got that wonderful baby carriage back. And he said, well, look in your rearview mirror. He goes, why would I look in the rearview mirror? The carriage was in the trunk. I gave it back to him. And the dispatcher was at him. He said, pull over the car and look in your car. And he goes, all right, I guess I'll bring the baby back. I forgot to give them the baby, but they did get the stroller.
So he was driving the baby around.
He was driving the baby around, but he did return the stroller.
I'm still struggling of laughing at your comment that you actually had funerals and the priest didn't even know the name of the person. He literally read it on the casket. Is that right?
100%. But like I said, those days are eliminated. Now we have these wonderful ministries of consolation that they go over everything with the family, with faxes. They pick out the readings, the pallbearers. Those days are over, thank God.
Yeah. So, Peter, the other thing that I know people will be interested in, you were right in the middle of, I guess we're still going through COVID, but when New York City was in the news, there was so much going on there. I don't think people understand what was happening in the funeral business in New York City.
Well, my thoughts are that anyone thinks that the pandemic was something that was made up or just didn't really happen just gets me really, really angry, because we came to the point in several of our locations that we just literally couldn't take any more funerals. And my brother's an independent funeral home in Brooklyn. He averages about 9 or 10 funerals a month. And in April of 2020, without talking out of school, I think he performed 70 services in 1 month.
Right.
And out of that month, he had a week, Bruce, where on Monday, he buried a father and a daughter that had passed away at the same time. On Tuesday, he buried a mother and a son that had passed away at the same time. And on Friday, he buried a husband and wife that had died at the same time. Now, in all our careers, we might have that happen once or twice, but can you imagine having that happen 3 times in 1 week?
No.
But the biggest thing that I learned from the pandemic was the value of people need to say goodbye. And we had live streaming options in our Jewish locations for snowbirds and college kids. And our partners at TributeCast, they told us, you really need to gear up. You're going to need mobile equipment. We've now gone to over 400 services that have been live streamed. We've covered 48 out of the 50 states, and Alaska was one of them. We've been in 50 countries, every continent in the United States. Over 20,000 people have watched our services. We've had services where we've had 1,000 or in the hundreds that have watched. But in the height of the pandemic, it was me, the rabbi, and the camera person. That was me usually, and that was the only people at the cemetery. And we had such a need. My daughter was a nursing student at the time, and she had one set of equipment and I had another. But if that's the only way that people could say goodbye was by participating in a live stream. My father-in-law passed away. We live streamed the funeral. My aunt passed away. We live streamed that funeral. And I always thought my greatest accomplishment was being on a team of people that took care of dignitaries and presidents and very important people. But just being able to provide this service, I think, is probably the crowning achievement of my funeral service career, if you ask me.
It changed the whole industry. I mean, you just about every funeral home you go to now. I just got back from a family funeral, and they were streaming it, and it changed everything. But what people don't understand, I mean, you guys were flooded just you had to get help to come in from all over the United States just to handle the deceased and figure out who was who and where they were going. And there were families you couldn't see for weeks and weeks after they died because they had to get in line, right?
Well, in April of 2020, I came down with COVID, and I work out of our flagship location in Babylon, New York. We loss is always a bad term when a funeral director says loss, but every person that worked in that facility had COVID. And it wasn't for the power of our network at the company SCI that we work for with the Dignity Memorial Network, we literally would have been out of business. We had people from Texas, Florida, Oregon. Our entire staff was compromised of people that did not live in New York City. And I tell you what, they installed some systems to this day that have helped us, better tracking with software of where our decedents were in the process. I called them our angels. They were calling them volunteers, but I literally called them our guardian angels. If they did not show up, we literally would have been out of business.
And I remember sending people there from my area. Can you imagine somebody from Georgia, flying into New York City and say, here, you do this, and you don't know the geography or you don't know how it operates there? I mean, that was a major, major thing going on. This company that I worked for 23 years that you're employed with now, the people came from everywhere. And that happened in other parts of the country. Later, we had the same thing going on in LA, and it was just an incredible time. And I agree, if people think that wasn't real, they should hang around some of these guys like you that were right in the middle of it.
Well, funeral directing is a very, very misunderstood profession. Nobody really knows what we do. They used to think that we used to just drive around in Cadillacs and just take care of people. But I will tell you this, for a funeral director to do what they did during a pandemic is unbelievable, because in the beginning, we were petrified that we might get the disease from the decedent, which was absolutely not the case. Anyone that got sick from being in contact with a family. But can you imagine someone who's not sick saying, my friends, my colleagues need help. I'm going to leave my family behind. I'm going to drive across the country, or a few of people got flights. I'm going to drive across the country in a removal van with 2 stretchers, get there, and I'll just make removals for 2 weeks and come home. And to me, that's the most wonderful sacrifice that you can give in our profession, to leave your own family and your own business to go help others while people needed that. And that's a calling that not many people understand what we do.
It was a very proud moment. and everybody began to see the power of people stepping up to do whatever they had to do to get somebody out of the ditch. And that's basically New York City and New Jersey and all that area was in the ditch. I mean, it was incredible.
I'll
So
tell you
Peter,
one
you've
more
had a
story.
great career. You to tell me about your family.
I've got 3 kids. I've got my oldest son is Michael. He's 31 years old. He's in the advertising business. He just got married. His wedding was actually postponed for 6 months because of COVID. Him and my daughter-in-law, Nicole, they live out in Northport. They're doing very, very well. I'm very proud of them. My son Gregory is in the funeral business with us. He's not licensed yet. Hopefully one day he's going to finish his requirements and get his license. And my daughter Sophia is a real hero, and she's a registered nurse. And actually, she was a registered nurse in Long Island, who's now moving into New York City. And what we did, we were involved after the death had happened. But what our nurses did in Long Island and New York City and all across the country, that's a job that just doesn't get enough recognition, and we'd be lost without them.
So my brother's daughter, Amy, she's a registered nurse. She's a traveling nurse. So she actually came and worked in New Jersey for several weeks. She was like a different person when she came back, but it was a life-altering event for her to be in the middle of those hospitals in New Jersey, right in the heat of that.
And I remember calling up my wife one day and I said, listen, I'm bringing my friend home for dinner. And she said to me, goes, you do realize we're in the middle of a pandemic and you're bringing someone home for dinner. I said, well, I don't usually bring people home from work, my dear, but this man drove up from Florida and is going to help us make removals. And it's probably the only meal that he's going to get for the next 2 weeks that's edible. You're an excellent cook. Do me this one favor. And my wife made him a beautiful meal. And he came up and he helped us for 2 weeks. And it was basically all hands on deck.
Yeah, and he will never forget your kindness. Your story reminded me of my mom, just like your wife, was a wife of a funeral director. The biggest fights I heard them have, arguments. They really weren't fights, but arguments. Daddy would come home. My mom's name was Naya, N-A-I-A. He said, Naya, you're singing at the funeral tomorrow. I mean, Mama couldn't sing, but there's no telling how many funerals she sang at. He said, just do me a favor, sing at this funeral. They don't have anybody to sing. I'll tell them you'd be glad to do it. So there's no telling how many solos Mama sang at funerals, and I promise you she couldn't sing, and she's ready to kill him when she got through the funeral for having to do it. So it's amazing what funeral directors' wives do. You bring home somebody, but to eat. But I can tell you that person, whoever that was, will never forget your kindness for doing it.
Well, I'll tell you a story. Growing up in Brooklyn, my grandmother was very, very Italian. And when we first got married, we lived in one of the apartments above the funeral home. And my grandmother sat down with my wife and she said to her, Lori, there are going to be times when your husband's not going to be able to come home for dinner. He's going to be on call. He's going to have to make a removal in the middle of the night. What are you planning on doing? And my wife said, well, I'll eat. That was the wrong answer for my grandmother, but it's a different world back then. What we did back then and what we do now, funeral service has changed dramatically. The pandemic has changed the playing field, but at the end of the day, there's a need for what we do, and there's a lot of great people, not only in our company, but in our industry, who have made things tremendously easier for the families that we have the privilege of serving.
Yeah, one of the things you said at the beginning of this that is really true, if there's one thing the pandemic taught me, and I think you said the same, is the importance of what we do. I mean, it is really difficult when you have a loved one die and you can't even go see them. You can't go pay your respects. You don't get to hug necks for people that would normally come and be there for you. I saw the importance of what we do in a different light during the pandemic. All of a sudden, we were burying people with no funeral until we figured out how to do it. But even then, it was a difference than being hands-on and, people getting the neck hugged and all that happens that we have been seeing all our lives.
Well, my father-in-law died in the height of the pandemic. My father-in-law died in June. And when you tell someone that you're lucky, it really makes no sense. My father-in-law had liver cancer for over 10 years, and it was a medical miracle. And he just died unexpectedly when he was in the hospital. He died on a Wednesday. And I know that for a fact, because I can tell you this. If my father-in-law would have died on Monday, the rules in New York City and New York State were no more than 10 people could attend the service. But being that he had passed away on Wednesday, they had just repealed the law, and it was now 1/3 of the capacity of the funeral. Now, it wasn't anything like a traditional funeral that the man was entitled to, but instead of having just 10 people where some of his grandchildren or some of his immediate family would not have been able to been there, we were able to have the entire family there. So it's little things like that that you're grateful for when you're dealing with a tragedy. But I think you have to have humor, and you have to be able to, make things easier for people. And I always said that the biggest compliment that I've ever received as a funeral director is not from the families that we serve, it's from the families that we don't serve, where somebody will run up to me and said, we lost someone in my family, and just not having you and your brothers around, it just made such a difference that we wish you guys were around. And I grew up in a very, very close-knit Italian family with an Irish mother. In the height of the pandemic, this gentleman had passed away, and he had passed away from MS, where he had lost his function, his motor functions. And this was in the height where you can only have 10 people. And they said to my brother, he goes, well, how can we handle this funeral? And my brother made arrangements in the house, and he realized that they had a ramp to get him in of the house. And he goes, I'll tell you what we can do. There's really no funeral home that we can go to right now. Why don't we bring your loved one back to your house, and we'll have an old school Italian funeral in your house. And this family was so appreciative of what we did. And it was my brother's idea. It was a wonderful idea. They helped with everything. That we brought the casket down the ramp, and we set it up in the little porch. It almost looked like a small old New York City funeral home. But to do things like that, another close friend passed away in the neighborhood unexpectedly. Well, that wasn't able to have a funeral. And my brother, give my brother a lot of credit. My brother kept our family's business going when my dad died. He was halfway through his residency, and without my brother, the D'Arienzo funeral home would not have survived. My brother was really quick on his feet. And my brother came up with an idea. Listen, no one's going to be able to come and say goodbye to Joe. So what we're going to do is my brother brought Joe to the neighborhood that Joe lived in, parked the hearse in the family's driveway, opened the door, and everybody was able to come and say goodbye. Because my dad always used to tell us, anybody can do a funeral. We want to do all the funerals. So do whatever you can to make that family come back. And I think that's the core of our business, Bruce. It's we go the extra yard. We do things that people don't do. We think of things that people don't think of. And it's paid off in the long run for both of us.
When I grew up, we took most of the bodies home. The visitation was at home. And even my grandfather, so my great-grandfather started our business, but my grandfather, who I worked with for many years, he used to embalm at home. I mean, they had one of these gravity percolators, we called them, and they did the embalming at home. But even when I was in business, we took people home and still did. I mean, it got less and less, but we took people home, and I've had some funerals at home, but back then they had a lot of funerals. So my point is, what happened in this pandemic, it caused us to go back full circle to where the business, the industry started, right?
100%. And the neighborhood that I grew up in, there were two main churches. There was St. Francis and there was Mount Carmel. And back in the day, I was directing this funeral, and the hearse driver is looking at me as I'm directing him to go to the church. And we pull up in front of Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church for the funeral mass. And as I'm going up the steps to check everything, the limousine driver comes running out of the car, and he says to me, "Do you realize that we're in the wrong church?" And I did not. I thought we were supposed to be at St. Francis, and we were at Mount Carmel. And I said, "All right, just give me a minute. What should I tell the family?" I said, "Just give me a minute." I walked inside. The pastor at Our Lady of Mount Carmel was a very charismatic, wonderful priest. His name is Monsignor David Casada. And I told him what I was up against. And he goes, "Oh, don't worry. I'll just come with you to St. Francis, and I'll celebrate the Mass with you." And sometimes, Bruce, it's better to be lucky than it is to be good. Because I walked down the steps with the Monsignor. The wife said to me, "Is he coming to St. Francis to say the Mass? We always liked him better than the other priest." I said, "Yes, he is, and that's why I'm here." So
It was all
every now and
planned,
then,
right?
100% fumble that turned into a touchdown. But
Wow.
sometimes you get lucky.
So I had you reminded me of a story. We didn't, most of the funerals where I came from are Protestant funerals, and we had a few Catholic funerals. And of course, in New York City, you deal with every kind of funeral you can think of, but most of ours was Protestant. But so when we had a Catholic funeral, we did it differently than we did a Protestant funeral. One of those things is we took the casketed remains, and the family all came to the church at the same time. And that's when we started the funeral. And the funeral director or whoever was working would be at the church and seating people and all that. Protestant funerals, we took the casket remains an hour before the funeral. So it's a different thing. But anyway, my dad was still working and had a guy that worked for us that was really just out of school, or maybe he was still in school. But I had a church full of people. I was standing out on the sidewalk with the priest, and here comes the family. My daddy driving the limo, my guy that worked for us driving the hearse. I was working the church, and I had a guy helping me. It was a huge deal. And when I opened the back door of the hearse, I had the pallbearer stand up, and I told, bring me the church trucks over. They forgot the church trucks. And we had no church trucks, and we had a church full of people, and we were 40 minutes from our funeral home. And so I thought, what in the world am I going to do? So the priest, when I walked by him, he said, "You forgot your wheels, didn't you?" Yeah. So I go in the church, and I go in the church dining hall, and I saw this big long table like you have in a church building. And we just walked down front, very dignified, and we set the table up at the front of the church full of people. And I told the pallbearers, we're going to walk all the way in, you're going to walk all the way down. And they put that casket on that table, and I was praying that it wasn't going to collapse. I had no idea if it would hold it up. I was petrified. But we got through it, and I don't know, maybe a year later, I'm with a lady whose husband had died, who was a member of that church. And I was telling her that story. I said, I will never forget the last time I was at your church. I told her that story, and she said, that is funny, because I thought that is nice that they bring that table down like that instead of rolling in and out. She said, I thought that was the neatest thing I've ever heard. So I was trying to fix something that most people thought was pretty cool.
So the trend of being lucky as opposed to being good worked for you as well. And I'll tell you one more. In New York City, we have an elite team of New York City pallbearers who carry the casket in and out of church on their shoulders. It's a precise military team. They're lined up by order of height, and they do a phenomenal job. And we're at some very, very extravagant church in downtown New York City. And I said to them, gentlemen, you need to put on a show. We have the mayor. We have a lot of people here today. Let's make sure this carry goes perfect. When we leave the steps, when you make the turn, a little bit of a dramatic pause, walk to the hearse, lower it down, and then we'll be on our way. And I'm standing on the steps, and I'm watching this thing, and it's going like clockwork. These guys are dressed meticulously. The casket is straight. Everything is perfect. They get off they come down the steps of the church. The dramatic pause lingers. The dramatic pause becomes uncomfortable. The dramatic pause now causes me to leave the family and find out what's going on. And I said to the gentleman at the back, I said, can you explain to me why you're not putting the casket into the hearse? And he goes, Peter, look inside. What would you like us to do? When we left to come back out for church, a homeless gentleman in New York City had taken custody of the hearse and moved some of his belongings in there and was laying in the back of the hearse with a pillow. And I said, here we go again. How do I explain this to the family? And the family thought it was the funniest, most appropriate thing, because the guy was a jokester like you and I, and they just thought it was fantastic. But that was a delay that lingered on too long, that wound up working out pretty good for us at the end as well.
I had a friend that this happened to. He was, it was a big funeral, same thing. Dignitaries were there, and everybody was at the church. He pulled up, the family in their car behind, watching them. They didn't have the precise pallbearers like you have in New York City. I've seen them, but they had the 6 pallbearers, and they were anyway, they lined up. He opened the back door up, and they forgot the body. They didn't even have the casket in there. Part-time guy got in the wrong hearse when they came over, and there was no casket in there. And so I don't know how he got out of that one, but the family were, just like you said, they thought it was funny that he didn't show up for his own funeral. So Peter, I'm going to tell you something, my friend, that I learned a long time ago. You know, I've been in the business all my life. My parents died about 94. Right after that is when I, started speaking, and their death is what caused me to go speak, because, I was very close to my parents, and I was telling funny stories. I was being serious and funny, but the more I told the funny stories, the more people loved it. And I would tell, because I didn't want people to think I'm making light of death. I mean, this is what I've done all my life. I was put on earth to do this, and I really care about what I'm doing. But people love to see the lighter side. I mean, we're all human beings, and I remember, and it still happens today. People lined up after I'm speaking, and my speaking engagements got bigger, and the crowds got bigger. But people be lined up and said, "I want you to handle my funeral when I die." It is. They laugh. They love to laugh, and I certainly wasn't making light of death. But what I was doing is looking at the quirkiness of life and letting people find something to smile about. And I can tell you that I have learned that it's very important. We certainly know when to laugh and when not to laugh. People need to see the lighter side. We would go nuts. Personally, I would have gone nuts in this business if I couldn't see the lighter side of life. And I'm telling you, some funny things happen when you're not supposed to be laughing. I mean, that's just the truth in life. It's more funny when you're not supposed to be laughing. When my dad died,
I'm sorry,
and
go
I'm
ahead.
telling you, I was close to my dad. We had the first viewing for Dad, and I've got 2 brothers and a sister, and our kids were there, our spouses were there, and it was a private viewing for my dad. We were going to see him for the first time, and Daddy had a cousin, Nita, who he was very close to, that he looked after. She was 97 years old, a lot older than him, 20 years older than him, but he looked after her. And Nita was supposed to be there for the first viewing. And we were, looking at Daddy and viewing him, and we all had tears in our eyes and kind of hugging each other's necks. It's very quiet. And all of a sudden I realized we forgot to pick up Nita. I said, Lord of mercy, we left Nita. We got to go get Nita. And my brother, 2 years older than me, that's never been in the funeral business, he said, Bruce, it'd be easy for us to take Daddy over to see Nita than it would be to go get her and bring her over here. Nita was not only 97, but she was a big lady. We all laughed. I mean, it's right in the middle of the sadness, everybody laughed. And it was so healthy. The best people I know in this business are people that can see the lighter side of life. It really is like medicine.
Bruce, the 2 most influential men in my life are my dad, who I lost when I was 22 years old, and his brother, my Uncle Nick, who's a doctor who just turned 90 years old. And we were telling a lot of stories at my uncle's birthday party. And my uncle's a character. But the classic story that he would tell is that they were at a wedding back in the day in Brooklyn. My grandfather and my grandmother, who ran the funeral home, my father and my mother, the funeral director and his wife, and my Uncle Nick, the neighborhood doctor, and his wife. 6 of them are sitting at a table together, and someone comes frantically running over to my uncle. Someone has fallen ill on the dance floor. Can you come over? And my uncle got up and walked over and tried to help the gentleman. And about 10 minutes later, the same gentleman came back to the table, and he said, your brother couldn't seal the deal. We need the funeral guy now. And it just makes you laugh. And even in bad times, my uncle and my aunt were on a funeral one day for a very, very close friend of theirs. And everything on this funeral went wrong. There was delay after delay. The procession got lost going to the cemetery. They fumbled the prayers. It was an absolute disaster. And my aunt said to the funeral director, I've never been to a funeral that's been run so poorly in my life. My family is in the funeral business. They never would have allowed this to happen. And the gentleman said, oh, I'm sorry. What's your name? She goes, oh, my name is Mrs. D'Arienzo. My nephews run the D'Arienzo funeral home in Brooklyn. And the funeral director goes, oh, I know the D'Arienzo brothers well. They fired me. And my uncle said, I can see why.
Peter, thank you so much for hanging on here today and talking to me. I think the neatness of this will be just people hearing a South Georgia guy and a New Yorker talking who are friends. One thing that working for our company has allowed both of us to do, I think, is to have our horizons expanded where we meet people from different parts of the country. And as I said, I have a ton of respect for you. I consider you a friend. You are a pro's pro. You're very good at what you do. I thank you for your friendship. A lot of people look to you for leadership. I thank you for being real. It's been a pleasure to have you on here today.
Well, you're a good man. I've always enjoyed your company as well. And I really didn't want to do this thinking that I'd make a fool of myself, but my wife reassured me that don't worry, no one's going to see you. It's you have a perfect face for radio, so just do what you got to do, and I'm sure Mr. Goddard will do the right thing and it'll be nice to you. And as always, you're a gentleman, a scholar, and I consider you a friend. If there's anything I can ever do to help you and your family, please reach out and continue these podcasts. I enjoy them immensely on my walk. You're very entertaining. And not only are you funny, but you're humble. That story about the lady who raised you and your family was really, really moving and powerful. And just keep on doing what you're doing. It's been a pleasure knowing you for all these years. Stay well, my friend.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.